My name is Filippo Lechtaler. I will start with myself, introducing myself. I'm head of ProClim. This is the climate unit of the Swiss Academies of Sciences, and I'm very happy to moderate this session on the topic scientists in different roles from research to activism. And of course, this session topic fits very well into the overarching theme of this conference, which is the exploration of the boundary between science, political engagement, or political activism. And if I go back to yesterday's keynote session by Niels Mede, he has reminded us that openness to political engagement, public engagement, comes with specific trade-offs. So scientists and science communicators are more exposed and more prone to criticism from the public, from politics, from media. And I think we all realize that this dialogue-oriented science communication comes at a specific cost. Somehow we find ourselves confronted with a very basic question. So does this public engagement really serves the purpose of, co-creating together a sustainable future between science policies? Or are we taking a risk to damage credibility of the main asset of science itself? So I think we all agree that a well-functioning science policy mechanism is key, but yet if you look at the current public discourse, the rules of the game, the boundary conditions are not commonly understood or commonly accepted. And I think we really need to have a discussion about this. And this is what we do here at the conference, what we do with this session, and this is really great. So I'm very happy with this session that we are looking at this intriguing and very current issue through a specific thematic lens, which is climate or climate change, which is arguably the most exposed topic nationally, internationally on the science policy interface. So on the one hand, climate science has a long-standing history, more than 30 years of systematically consolidating scientific evidence and bringing it to the attention of policymakers through, for example, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. But on the other hand, if you look at current policy implementation plans, nationally, regionally, we also know that policy measures are not ambitious enough to really prevent serious consequences for our generations to come. And with this gap or this discrepancy between what we know and what we do, we see a lot of scientists and science communicators in recent years which are led to leave their comfort zone behind their desk and be more involved in a political and public dialogue. And this is a bit the context I would like to set here for this keynote speech, and I'm very happy to have two representatives of the Swiss climate science community here with us as keynote speakers. They are internationally renowned scientists, and I'm very pleased to have Sonia Seneviratne with us, which is professor for land climate dynamics at ETH Zurich. One of her research topics are climate extremes, heat waves and droughts. She has contributed to different assessment reports of the IPCC, and she has been elected this year vice chair of the working group 1 of the current cycle of the IPCC. Warm welcome, Sonia, and I'm also glad to have Julia Steinberger with us. She's professor at the University of Lausanne for ecological economics, so she studies the interaction between natural resource use, society, economic performance. She has also contributed as a lead author to the last assessment report of the IPCC on climate mitigation pathway. So warm welcome to you both here at this keynote session. The aim of the session today is to jointly reflect, and I emphasize the word jointly, on the question whether climate research, and maybe research in general, can be, which is sustainability oriented, can be done without getting more involved in, let's say, more normative or political questions. It's to reflect what the challenges and opportunities are and what the rules of the game should be. And we will do this joint reflection in two parts. We will first lean back and listen to the experience or the perspective of these two very experienced experts in research, climate research, as well as in the political outreach. They will both have each 10 minutes to present their view. And then, in a second part, we will have time, 30 minutes, we will move into a more interactive session. And Philip has told me that you already started yesterday to discuss on this topic. And I really encourage you, I strongly encourage and invite you to share your thoughts, to ask questions that kept you awake this night. And Julia and Sonia will do their best to answer and discuss this. I will, as a moderator, I will structure this discussion in a most inclusive way by using the so-called Slido tool, which you may already know. So it's easy to use. Again, just scan the QR code. You will be directly directed to a web page. You go to the Q&A tab where you can enter your question. So this is one thing. But the second thing, which helps us to understand what you prefer, you can also vote questions. So we will have a ranking order of questions that I will then select and transmit to our speakers, and we will be happy to discuss with you on this very current issue, science policy interface from research to activism, scientists in different roles, and we will now have these scientists in different roles speaking. We will start with Sonia Seneviratne. You have 10 minutes. I will be in charge of timekeeping. The floor is yours. Welcome, Sonia.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, perfect. So, yeah, I would like to thank Filippo for the introduction and the organizers for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to make this presentation, and certainly it's a bit of a new topic for me compared to what I present normally, but in any case, I do think it's an important topic. What I want to start with are first actually those pictures. It's just to say we are in a climate crisis. I mean, we are dealing with a major problem. You just have to look at those pictures, and there would be many more. If you think of the North Hemisphere heat waves this year, also last year, for instance, last year, 2022, we had more than 60,000 people who died of the heat wave in Europe. I mean, it's not as if it's not having consequences. People are dying of climate change now. If you look at the picture from Canada, we have massive fires. Also this summer, total area that was burned corresponds to 4 times the area of Switzerland. Switzerland also we are affected in summer, but also in winter. Now it starts to be even difficult to organize ski competitions in winter. That's where the pictures of Adelboden earlier this year. And I mentioned some other events, for instance, droughts last year, also the flooding in Pakistan, but for instance this year in Libya because of the heavy precipitation, and then the flooding also in Germany again. Also those flooding events lead to many deaths. This is not only about those different events, but also if you're looking at the evolution over time, it's getting worse year after year. What you're looking here is the temperature that we had in the recent years, and you see in dark, in red at the top, the temperature of this year. In September, we had a total anomaly that was corresponding to 1.75 compared to the reference climate. So basically, we were way above 1.5 degrees in this one single month. And you see clearly that this year was really outstanding. We are dealing with a major problem. There is no question about this. The other problem, Filippo mentioned it as well, is we have a problem, but we're not really doing anything about it. This is basically a statement that was given by the UN saying that we are going to miss our climate targets unless the fossil fuels are phased out. That was a summary of the global stocktake that was prepared in advance to the climate conference that will take place in Dubai. And so basically, the evaluation is quite clear. We shouldn't be doing much more if we want to have a chance to achieve the goals that we have set ourselves, that the policymakers have set themselves to achieve, which is to limit global warming well below 2 degrees, and if possible, to 1.5 degrees. So I would say sometimes as a climate scientist, at least I feel a bit like in this position, as if I were in this bus. So I'm the scientist, so I'm computing all the data, and I see, it looks really dangerous, it really looks really bad, but I'm not the driver, I'm also not the boss of the driver. So the question is, what do you do about this? How can you make sure that this bus doesn't go down the cliff? And so, of course, what we can do is to basically sound the alarm. You say, okay, I have to say something, I have to say stop, stop. But for instance, we know what is the reaction to this. For instance, there was the movie Don't Look Up, which shows a very nice scene where scientists are trying to sound the alarm, but in the end, it's not welcome, because it's not funny. People want to have fun, and they're like, well, no, I don't want to listen to this. This sounds like really bad news. Yes, bad news, but you have to look at it. Nonetheless, the problem is, how do you give this message across? Now, what scientists have tried for many decades now is just to summarize all the knowledge we have. So Philippe also mentioned it's really important to have very robust science. That's what we have done within IPCC. We are still doing within IPCC. So basically, IPCC is an assembly of the different countries of the world, and then scientists are tasked with doing reports. And the first report basically went in the 90s. Now we have also had a series of reports, and we also present those reports. For instance, the picture in the middle here was, I was including this picture. We were presenting the IPCC conclusions at a COP meeting. So we are trying to summarize all this information, but the question is it taken up? And do we need to do more if we want this message to go across? Now, some other ways to get the message across is maybe to try to have other fora to present the information. And so, for instance, one interesting aspect is to look at what could be done in court. I'm including here a picture that was taken after a case in the French-speaking part of Switzerland where climate activists were acquitted in first instance. They had actually played tennis in Credit Suisse bank, and well, there is still climate change, there's no longer Credit Suisse, but still, anyway, they were acquitted because it was ways that they had tried to find to, again, bring the topic in the media. And I was asked in this court actually to provide a testimony on what we know from climate change. It was just after the 1.5 degree report, and I think my testimony, that's what the judge said, was actually one big reason why he decided to acquit them. And so we can try to give this message across, also in the context of this case. Together with many colleagues, Julia also signed this letter. We basically said that we were worried. That was actually answering questions from different lawyers. In the second instance of this case, where we answered those questions, and one of the questions was, as a scientist, are you worried? And the answer was, yes, we are worried. And basically, the main specialist experts of climate science signed this letter. So we are worried. About using climate science in the context of courts or legal issues, I think an interesting point, and that scientists are not always aware, is that we might not have the same standards of proof. So for instance, that was a really interesting point that came from a discussion I had with Naomi Oreskes. She's a historian of science at Harvard, and the first author of this paper is a philosopher. And we exchanged about the idea of how can we use IPCC evidence in courts. An interesting point is that, for instance, in civil courts in the US, the bar basically to make a decision is that the evidence should be more likely than not. So for instance, if you find that it is more likely than not that somebody has basically been responsible for some issue, so then basically you can take a decision. You don't need to be 90% sure. And actually this is not exactly the same standard of proof as we are using in science. Often in the IPCC report we are focusing on evidence where we are 90% sure, 95% sure, 99% sure. And actually we should realize that even information where we are more than 50% sure that it is true, this information should be shared, for instance, in a legal context. I think in general, in terms of communication, one thing we can do is just broaden also the different messengers. And this is happening right now because also other fields are basically finding that climate change is a major issue for them. Also now, members of health science are basically sounding the alarm and saying, 1.5 degree, it would be a limit that we don't want really to exceed very much because there are major health impacts also associated with climate change. Now, in terms of changing, what is happening, why we are not moving, I think the main problem is inertia. So you could criticize a person who's trying to push this boulder, but part of the problem is also the boulder, that it's very, very difficult to move. And maybe that's where the question of activism comes there. We need some action to get this boulder moving, certainly. But the question is also, why is the boulder not moving? And I think one problem is the question of the sunk cost fallacy. So the idea is that you have invested in some way of living in the past, and maybe you have to question this in the future. So imagine, I don't know, a family was maybe a house far away, they have to take a plane to go there, and now if they have to question this, okay, I have to take a train, so it will take much more time, possibly. So you have to, ask yourself, is that the right decision now to go? If somebody lives far away and needs to take a car, so is that the right decision again? And so this idea of you have invested a certain way of living and you have to question this if you want to basically go in another direction. I think the main issue is that basically all the adversaries of change are kind of, or basically of climate action are kind of saying, oh, let's not do anything. But the message we should get across is that status quo is not an option. So no matter what we do, our lives are going to change. One option is basically we do something about this, we reduce our emissions, and then the climate is going to stay more or less as we know it now. The other option is we don't change our life, we don't change basically our habits, but then the climate is going to change, it's going to affect our life very much. So I think one way to get people to move, to get this boulder to move, is of course to highlight that there are major dangers of not moving. But one point I also wanted to make is that we need both the stick and the carrot. Maybe you need also some motivation for people to move. So we need to have some type of desirable end goal, or basically to have change that is that people want to achieve. And I think one message we don't get across sufficiently is that a world in which we would have very limited CO2 emissions would be nice. We don't need to be afraid of decarbonization. We could be very, very happy in this world. It would not be that different in terms of quality of life from now. Actually, probably it would be better. So there would be a lot of benefits. First, we would have less climate impacts and costs for ecosystem and health. We would have less climate uncertainty. We would know where we are. There would be also several co-benefits with health. We would have less local air pollution, less noise. Also, if we eat healthier diet, it's better for the climate. And we would have more geopolitical security because we would have less dependency on autocratic fossil fuel exporting regime, which I think is also a plus point. So I just wanted to say in the context of communications, for instance, after the IPCC 1.5 degree report, we prepared this infographic where we showed different worlds for the future, just showing it's a choice about our possible futures, and we can take decisions right now which can bring us to this more sustainable future where we have less change in climate, but we have to change our society, or we do nothing about our society, but then we'll have massive, massive consequences on climate. So I finish with those words. Every action matters, every bit of warming matters, every year matters, and every choice matters. Thanks for the attention.
Thank you, Sonia. We will move directly to Julia's presentation. I remind you, you can already start noting down your questions. We will take them up afterwards. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers as well. And Filippo for the introduction. Okay, I basically get asked to talk about two things, science or activism. So this is basically part of my activism talk that I'm sharing today, since that seems to be one of the topics. And it'll make my life easier if I can hold this. Okay, and one of the things that I think is very interesting in recent years is that the University of Lausanne produced this report on research and engagement, which goes over things like objectivity, neutrality, what engagement looks like, its different phases, and what kinds of responsibility we have as scientists when we engage in public communication or public interaction of any kind, really. Okay, so Sonia showed us something about the urgency and sort of overwhelmingness of the climate and as well as the ecological crisis. So these call for radical transformation, and one of the things I don't know is I don't know if the scientific community itself is taking that seriously. I think that we have a way of doing research, teaching, and learning that is very much oriented towards the problems we used to have maybe 200 years ago or 150 years ago, and we're not really fit for purpose right now. I think that the popular movements that are doing activism are much more responding to the urgency of our moment than the research community. And one of my questions for all of us is, can we support them? Can we help them out? Are we doing the things that we should do in our job in order to help them get their job done? So different kinds of activism. I think that one of the things is that we always have to think about is, why is activism necessary? Why not just science-informed policy? And this goes to a research question. This is a scientific question. How do we understand change? What does change look like? What change are we aiming for? How does social change happen? And I think that it's really important to understand that there are different types of activism. I mean, very far outside my comfort zone here. I was trained in physics, all of this stuff. I am an amateur, but I've tried to learn a bit. There's different types of activism, different goals, different strategies, different types of effectiveness. Nonviolent civil disobedience plays a very important role when you're trying to change something with a lot of inertia. And there's also an importance of ongoing critical reflection and learning. So within activism, we also think, research, and learn. And one of the things I think is really important to understand here is that as scientists, we often think we understand systems. But you only understand a system when you try to change it. If you're just observing it, you know nothing. You just know the propaganda level. When you're trying to change a system, that is when you actually learn something about how it really functions. And so another way to say this is what Rosa Luxemburg said, is those who do not move do not notice their chains. And as researchers, if we're not moving, we might not notice what our surrounding systems are made of. So actions and activism is what helps us understand our societies, I would argue. Okay, why do we need activism? The ideal view of science communication is a researcher, shown here, still happy. My great research indicates we should change our policy. Writing a policy brief, not just a scientific paper, they're already doing good work here. And then you have a politician saying, oh, cool, I have read the brief, and I agree, and I will now work to change our policy. And that is a very nice view of the world that has zero to do with reality, because in reality, however, politicians have a lot of demands on their orientations, they have a lot of demands on their time. That including lobby groups, strong forces in society, media representation of debates is very important. If the scientific representation of the debate is too far away from the media representation of the debate, they will not care. They have political party factions, they have focuses on local voters. They have, one of my favorites is the things this politician actually cares about. Who knows what they are? They have those too. They have a social class, a position in society, and they have current government processes. And in this picture, the scientist with a good idea is very, very small indeed. Moreover, the strong lobby forces are very effective at influencing media representations, and they're very practiced at intervening in government processes, including having entire ministries and budgets devoted to creating more car dependence, as we are seeing right now in Switzerland, for instance. So the conclusion from this is that good science is not enough. It has never been enough. It will never be enough. We need activism too. And one goal of activism is to give the necessity for social change a bigger voice. So, you have a scientist or a whole bunch of scientists like the IPCC giving the scientific basis for the motivation for change, and the activists basically act as a megaphone for that scientific reality and try to exert sufficient pressure on the politicians and the decision making. Okay, now we go into the research on what kinds of activism exist. There are multiple kinds of activism, and they all have pros and cons, and I think that very often when we talk about activism very generally, we forget that there are these different kinds. And this is a very schematic view. I am not an expert in this, but you basically have sort of low level of interaction, like the organizations, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, WWF, whatever. They're risk averse generally, they're generally oriented towards incremental goals. This is not always fair. And the theory of social change is generally aligned with social structure-based organizing. Whereas, you would have taking part in marches. We had, almost 1% of the Swiss population in Bern just a few weeks ago for climate. That's great. It is low risk, high visible, it can have some effect. It does not work for profound change against powerful opponents. And what it really mainly helps with is the visibility of the topic. And then you have your nonviolent civil disobedience, like the youth strikes, Extinction Rebellion, and so on. Highly visible. It resonates with the public positively or negatively. And it changes the terms of the debate. So that's one of the things that it really helps with. It's high risk, it involves personal sacrifice, it is disruptive, and that's sort of the theory of change, is sort of popular movement. So one of the things we can think about, and I hope you've seen this diagram before, if you haven't, you really need to do yourself a favor today and go and read Donella Meadows' Leverage Points, How to Intervene in a System. So what Donella Meadows, who is one of the systems theorists behind the Club of Rome, pointed out was that if you're trying to change a system, there are more shallow leverage points and deeper leverage points. And the standard interventions are shallow leverage points. They will move the system a bit. If you want to have a bigger effect, you need to change things like system rules, system structure, the system goal even. And I would say that probably our different kinds of intervention as researchers or as activists can be aligned with these different kinds of intervention points. So for instance, a briefing note or a policy brief is probably pretty standard, shallow. The structure-based organizing is probably somewhere in the middle. And then the uprising, the nonviolent civil resistance, that's probably at a much higher level of trying to achieve system change. So there is a research case for nonviolent civil disobedience. So basically, the way this works is that profound change against powerful entrenched elites, which are the reason we have inertia, requires a strong countering force. And you can describe these as coercion. So people power can't compete in terms of military or police power or even economic force, but it can still win despite coming from a less powerful position. And so the study of popular movements is something that's very important in order to understand how this would work, but the study of popular movements is neglected in political science. Very little political science cares about popular movements and how they win. So This Is an Uprising is this book by Engler and Engler where they try to sort of make a research case for what kinds of strategies can win. And there are a lot of contributions from practitioners, which is quite interesting. So including the writings of different practitioners. Like Gandhi and Martin Luther King and Judy Barry. What if we need to go beyond appeals to power? What if we need to go beyond trying to convince politicians to change? So this is one of the things that's very important, is maybe influencing politicians is just not going to work. Maybe we need to think of our intervention differently. And one of the things that this is one of the things that these researchers in this book does, is they try to go beyond appeals to power. And try to understand power as a social movement from above. And they propose different tactics, including confronting power, exposing power, delegitimizing power, or replacing power. And I think that at the current moment in time, our social movements are in fact justified in ceasing to appeal to power as their single most important goal, and starting to be much more confrontational, again, nonviolently, by exposing their lack of legitimacy, corruption, and harm as evidenced by their lack of action. I also would just like to highlight that we've been writing about scientific engagement and scientific activism, so the scientific community is writing more and more scientific articles on this. I would say that one of the first ones that really influenced me was The Scientist Must Act on Our Own Warnings to Humanity. The authors are Charlie Gardner and Claire Worldly. And one of the quotes is here from their article, which is, "The scientists who alerted the world to the climate and ecological crisis have a moral duty to stand with the popular movements demanding political action." Following on that, we also endorsed mass civil disobedience for climate action. So 100, here it says 400, but it was actually over 1,000, I think. We just kept collecting signatures, and that was just an article that was published early on. We also pointed out that environmental protest is being criminalized around the world, including in Switzerland, and we have more and more research on why that's happening. So the fossil fuel companies have a bunch of think tanks, and those think tanks have an umbrella group called the Atlas Network that has been pushing criminalization of climate activism all around the world, including in Europe, including in Switzerland, including in Germany, including in France, and doing it very, very successfully. in the UK as well. I actually know the UK case a bit better. And I think that we have to take seriously this, what we tried to point out here. It has become abundantly clear that governments don't act on climate without pressure from civil society. So threatening and silencing activists is sort of a new frontier in anti-democratic refusal to act on climate. And we also had some propositions on how to change the university sector, the research sector, and how we can try to do our jobs better at this rather crazy moment in human history. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of you, Sonia and Julia, for your presentations, sharing your thoughts, experiences, and suggestions. So we'll have...
Yeah. You probably need the screen, don't you?
No, I don't need, I can see it here. You can stay there. Okay. So I remind you that we are using Slido. I already saw that there are a lot of questions. So please also try to vote questions. We cannot select every question on the Q&A tab. So before we move to your intervention, to the audience's intervention, I would like to start off with some questions. And I mean, despite all this urgency to act, which has been very visible in both of your presentations, I would like to start on a rather positive note and ask you, both of you, whether you can share any, positive experience from science policy interaction, let's say in the last year, something that has motivated you or has given you confidence where you see we can embark on the right path.
Well, I would say maybe on lower level, but nonetheless the fact that the climate law has come through in Switzerland, I mean, it was certainly a substantial improvement. And it's still not sufficient for Switzerland to achieve basically what it needs to do to basically be on track of 1.5 degrees. Nonetheless, it was a progress, an effective progress in policy making. And it took a lot of years. I think we shouldn't forget. It starts from the initiative for the glaciers, and that started around 2015. So it takes a lot of years to have a small improvement, but it did happen.
I think that there have been quite a few examples of positive interaction. Unfortunately, they're usually dwarfed by the immediate negative ones. But I think that there are also some positive effects in terms of at least politicians can no longer say that they don't want to act on it. This is no longer effective. So we're seeing that politicians are being influenced by the science in the sense that they're having to justify inaction in more and more exotic and strange ways. So that's maybe another positive development.
Thank you. So another point, would like to bring the discussion a bit back to the theme of the session, which is scientists in different roles. And to some extent, you move between different roles. I mean, you're also citizens. I mean, you're free to express and engage in political activities as you see fit. But at the same time, the usual view on scientists engaging in the policy dialogue is it comes with expectations on objectivity and distance, not being prescriptive, etc. So I know this is very simplified, but do you think that moving between different roles to some extent affects your role or your career as a scientist? Do you see any risks? Do you already experience any consequences for this? The question is also directed to both of you.
Sure. Rather funnily, this building is right across from the police station I was brought at when I was arrested. The holding cells could do with a bit more paint. So I guess that there are expectations. Wait, I'll just let you do it. I guess that there are expectations. So taking part in certain types of communication, certain types of activism does go against expectations. What's really interesting, though, is to look at the pushback for different types of engagement. So one of the things I noticed when the few times I went to the television station or the radio station to express myself on topics of climate emergency, one of the things I was really interested to see was how many colleagues from the economics department seemed to spend their life in those lobbies and taking part in those shows, and they're never accused of not having impartiality or objectivity. because they're advocating generally for a continuation of the status quo and they are not threatening power. So one of the things to realize is that these accusations always are mobilized when somebody is challenging the status quo, challenging power. And so the uneven application of these standards, I think, is quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think I will take again the image I was showing of the bus. Basically, I do feel as a scientist, I have a moral obligation to inform about the state of emergency. I mean, I feel I would not be doing my job if I were not to inform the public about it. I think always think basically now, I can imagine, you know, in 20 years from now, let's say we have a massive climate catastrophe, which can happen if we have, we already have one, but it could be much worse if we hit some tipping point. I don't want to be accused of not having sound the alarms. That's why, where I see also a political danger for us as scientists, we could be accused in the future that we were not vocal enough, and we should be aware of this danger as well.
Thank you very much. So we now see on the screen the questions and the voting. See, the top question is, Julia, whether this affects your scientific career somehow, also implied by the first question. So you want to say something about that?
And it actually goes to your previous question that I didn't answer. It had several parts. So I think that, well, first, one of the funny things is that my research has actually radicalized me rather than the other way around. So a lot of my political positions actually come from researching things like how car dependence was established in our societies and the influence of the fossil fuel industry throughout history. So I've become more radical as a function of trying to understand how our economic system really works. In terms of the consequences for my career, I would say that they've been relatively disastrous in the sense that it takes up a lot of time. It can ruin your life because the communication burdens become stronger. And this is one of the things that I'm really, really honestly shocked about is our media landscape. So after the IPCC report came out, the one that I was involved with in Working Group 3, I had sort of 2 weeks where my dominant activity was answering journalist questions, and I had 40 media interactions in that time. One tiny little piece of activism, and I am still getting requests to go to talks, to answer interviews, and so on, months and months and months later. So actually more than a year later. So the level of demand for communication and the level of opportunity for communication is completely different. But except for wasting my time having to answer lots of questions, which is also part of my job, so I try to do it, but except for that, there have been no negative consequences on my career whatsoever.
Thank you. So I move to the second question, which is somehow, maybe I rephrase it a bit, hopefully I kind of catch the basic meaning of the question. So if information is not the main problem, how could the social sciences and humanities help us getting more impactful? You talked about, you know, getting to understand system transformation. What does this mean for research? I mean, there is this keyword of transformation research, participatory research. So does we need a change also natural sciences, for example, and climate sciences is conducted? Mm-hmm. What do we need here? What is your view?
Yeah, I do think we would need actually more interaction between climate scientists working on more the physical part of climate science and people working in social science to better understand some of what I was discussing. So what are the reasons for the lack of change? I think some of this has to do with psychology, with social science. So basically, working on the inaction part of the equation, because we know that we have a climate emergency. We know what we need to know about the climate system to know we have to do something about it. Now the problem we have is about getting society to change, and that's basically more of a social science question. But I think we need this interaction because also for the communication, still identifying which part of the climate information is most useful for this communication is still important. So we need this interaction.
Do you have any examples that illustrate this case where you use information in another way you would have used, I don't know, 10 years ago?
Well, I realize sometimes that very simple facts make a big difference. So I just, realize from speaking with people around me, from my family or neighbors, that sometimes very simple facts are actually not well understood. One really important point of information is the fact that we are dealing with a problem that is mostly irreversible for several human generations, because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for several hundreds to thousands of years. So basically, if we were to stop all emissions now, we are not going to go back to the 19th century climate. We're just going to stabilize more or less the climate as it is now. And I realized actually from discussion with people around me that this fact was not understood. It's not like basically air pollution, where you realize, okay, we stop pollution and then after 1 week we are fine. We are dealing with a problem. If we basically react at the point where we are saying it's not bearable, it's going to stay unbearable because we cannot go back.
Maybe I add to this something you've also mentioned during your presentation, that it's also about the framing of the information, that we can also think about a net zero world which is positive, that we enjoy, while the information we usually hear from scientists are more, I exaggerate a bit, catastrophic. They kind of warn us from, apocalypse, said in a very extreme way. How do you think, the way also climate scientists are, changing their way of communicating, whether this helps, whether there is sort of movement and development going on in this respect? And this also relates to some extent to the social science aspect.
Yeah, I think about basically creating this narrative for possible futures. That's a really important dimension, to say actually we would be fine and we could have a nice world. And actually there was science on this, also a paper which Julia contributed to, which is showing that decreasing our CO2 footprint is often associated with better quality of life. So for instance, let's say you decide to go with your bike or you walk to work instead of taking your car. It's generally better for your health, and that's the case for many of those decisions. And I think this information has just not come through. I mean, all this positive message on change that actually would be much better, not only for the climate, but also in other dimensions of our life. I think this message needs to be basically go across.
Thank you. So I look at the screen and pick another question. So, green activism, also a buzzword. Green activism resulted in a backlash in the recent federal elections with more right-wing representatives in power. Is activism actually counterproductive? So the hypothesis here is that the Green Party has lost acceptance due to being too offensive in the discourse about climate and biodiversity policies, etc. What is your view on this? And do you see any risks for real policy measures?
I guess I can say, I have to say that I was surprised at the level of backlash, especially in the German part of Switzerland. So I think that there's some real cultural differences in Switzerland. And I think in the French-speaking part of the world, having revolutions is sort of socially acceptable. Like from time to time, good. And I think that in the German-speaking world, there's much more of like a social propriety and like this is not done, and sort of conformism and various things that one has to be more aware of. And I certainly wasn't. I mean, I was really shocked. I got questions from journalists that were like, have you been fired yet? I'm like, usually we start the conversation with hello. Anyway, but so I think that there is a risk of backlash, especially because of these cultural dimensions. We don't always understand how things are going to be communicated, how things are going to be perceived. And I think that, but it's not a question of activism versus not activism. I think it's a question of creativity and activism. And that's one of the things I really wanted to point out in my presentation, is that activism itself is a research process. It's trial and error. You're experimenting with bringing a topic forward. You're not trying to become popular. There is a role for polarization, but one of the things you're trying to do is you have to always try to be clever about the effect that your actions are having. I think in some ways you could also say that the recent vote in the elections was not great for the Green Party. However, the climate vote, I think, was a higher majority than people expected. So I don't think that the messages are just in one direction or another. And I think that the main point here is that we have to keep intervening. The question is, can we be creative about how we do it? And can we sort of reverse some of these negative narratives as well.
Yeah, maybe I would add something, and yeah, maybe there asking on the question of how do you do a climate activism, and in the end, there is a message you want to get across, but I would say my perspective is we shouldn't do this against the population, so if possible, it would be good to take the population with us. And that's why I would rather try, that's my perspective, I would rather try to push with positive narrative, positive perspective about the fact that I assume that most of the people in the populations are good people. They don't want to take the wrong decision. You know, they don't want to destroy the environment on purpose. I assume they are good people, but maybe we have to change the perspective. So I try to rather appeal to the good in people, and that's and maybe try to have a nice and kind revolution. So maybe, yeah, I don't know, but it's difficult. But in a way, I would say probably you need both messages. But what you were saying about maybe the clever messages, I found, for instance, the action of those climate activists in the Credit Suisse bank, that was quite clever, I felt, because it was very funny, it was not dangerous, it was not really, you know, a big impediment for anybody, but the message went across because it was funny, and I feel maybe we should also play more on this type of fiber, basically using humor, maybe using positive sentiment. So anyway, I think we can do more on this side. Yeah.
The question was here somewhere before, it's not here anymore, but kind of try to take that up again. So as we're talking about the parliament and the elections, so we see now that we have maybe a more right, center-oriented parliament. And we also said in the beginning that the well-functioning mechanism, science policy mechanism, is key to move forward on the ground in climate policies. Now we have the situation where the dialogue must be sought with, you know, more parliamentarians from the right and the center. Do you think that science has a good access to, you know, the broad spectrum of the Swiss Parliament, or do we need to change narratives, or what are your views on that?
Well, I thought actually that was quite surprising. I mean, we had an event in Parliament, and so actually was a result from a quite dramatic action from Guillermo Fernandez. Actually did hunger strike, and I mean, again, that was a case where I felt it's an extreme measure, but in the end, we did have a presentation in Parliament from scientists, but I was wondering, why does it take so much for such an event to happen? Why can't we have, I mean, every time there is an IPCC report, just have a brief for the whole Parliament? It seems to make sense. I mean, I just feel, yes, indeed, there is a lot of impediments to communication, and of course, communication is not sufficient, but already, you know, being in touch, being able to share this information widely would help. Why don't we have more reports from IPCC reports also on television, you know, just this brief, this video of 10 minutes on television. I mean, there is propaganda all the time is a form of advertisement on television for cars, for, you know, high CO2 lifestyle. So why can't we have a bit more information, if you want propaganda, for basically helping to save the climate?
Yeah, I just want to relate two issues with respect to this sort of policy-science interface. One has only really become apparent to me quite recently, so I don't have a very structured way of explaining it. But one of the things I've realized is because climate and ecological crises have become a really central topic, political parties and politicians, and also to some extent corporations, are seeking out experts they like. So there's starting to be this whole sort of middle ground of consultancies or people who claim to be experts. These people are not IPCC authors usually, and that basically come and talk to those people and give them the message they want to hear, which is everything is fine, technology will save the day, we don't actually need radical transformative change, which is the conclusion of the IPCC reports.
Can you give an example on that? Just that we understand.
Yeah, but it's hard to do it without naming names, but a Swiss party, a Swiss right-wing party close to business, possibly narrowed it down enough, but sort of I tried to talk to their regional people, and I was like, you know, I'm local, I'm willing to talk to you guys, right? And they're like, oh, but we already have people that talk to us about climate and ecology. And I was like, who is it? And it was very interesting. So I think that that's one of the things to be aware of, is that there is this sort of netherworld or middle layer or whatever of people who are willing to take money to give politicians false information that they find comfortable, and then they consider themselves to be informed. And I think that this is something that we're probably not worrying enough about as a scientific community. The second point I want to raise is that Switzerland, I'll do the poll. How many people in this room have heard of the Energy Charter Treaty? All right, that's 4, and 5 if you include myself. The Switzerland is using the Energy Charter Treaty, which is an international trade regulatory binding treaty under the umbrella of the World Trade Organization architecture, to position itself as a rogue fossil fuel state in the middle of Europe. And by itself, Switzerland staying in the treaty is probably enough to stop the Paris Agreement from happening. Now, this is a problem. Our government is part of this treaty. Practically none of our citizens know that our government is doing this. And none of our politicians really know how the treaty is working, except for a couple who are trying to stop it, but nobody listens to them because it's boring. And so we have this real problem. The way this treaty works is it protects fossil fuel profits. So a fossil fuel company headquartered in Switzerland, and this is the Swiss government's official position, is that by staying in this treaty, they can encourage more fossil fuel companies to become headquartered in Switzerland. They can attack our European neighbors in the courts to sue them for climate policies that would result in lost profit and get the money back, and this is already happening. The canton of Tessin has an entity that is invested in a German coal plant, and they just sued the German government under this treaty to keep the coal plant open so they can keep their profits. So this is what Switzerland is doing very, very bad things, and we don't know about it democratically, and our politicians don't even know how this thing works. So I think that that's one of the things that we should take a lot more seriously.
Maybe as a follow-up on your first point, which is kind of the utilitarian use of expertise, selecting expertise, not being sure whether this is a systematic, consolidated evidence. So this is something about the science policy process. Do you have something in mind how this could be changed? So what can be done in the science communication system to improve this use of evidence and avoid, this, say, utilitarian use of expertise?
Yeah. Well, I can mention something which I also discussed with different people, also within Proclim, for instance, and also at ETH. One idea which I would find useful is maybe to try to do kind of Swiss level type of IPCC assessment. So what we do within IPCC is that scientists are preparing the report, but the summary is approved line by line by the different governments. And in those governments, we have Saudi Arabia, we have Russia, we have actually a lot of countries which probably don't want to have any change. Still, they approve this text. So the conclusion of IPCC have been approved by all countries of the world. And I think there, if we were to prepare some assessments, some briefs, but where we ask all the parties of Switzerland, we would have also a representative of SVP and all the different parties who would be there, and they can bring their comments. They can say, I don't want this sentence, and then we ask them why, and they have to have argument, and then we can answer the argument scientifically. And the final product would be a joint product from the scientists and the different political parties, the representatives of the administrations, and we would have a joint product where we say, all of us agree on this text. We know this is science, and it's basically valid. I think maybe that would be a starting point for then more action.
So let me rephrase that, and think this relates a bit to what have been discussed yesterday. We have to involve the users, the target groups, more closely in what we actually do and what we communicate in science. Do we have to move to more co-creation? And can that be a successful path from your point of view? And what could be the impact then of the research and again on academic careers if we do this?
I think the engagement is quite important, and I think that having these dialogues, and we've also set up dialogues from the University of Lausanne, we've set up dialogues between our Climate Institute and EPFL. We have a climate center between EPFL and Lausanne, and we've engaged dialogues with media, politicians, and industry or businesses, and these are really, really interesting. And I think that that's also another thing, is that the science policy interface works. Politicians care about people. They care about knowing you, your email, your name, and that they can call you or send you a WhatsApp message or whatever. And as opposed to just scientists who are like, well, did you read my article? Because I don't need to talk to you. So it's a very different kind of interaction, and I think that creating this interpersonal interaction of trust is very important. And that's probably one of the roles of ProClim. I think another thing that ProClim could do would be to set up this climate forum, similar to the biodiversity forum, where people who are acknowledged experts on climate, trusted experts on climate, either from the IPCC or similar, would be part of this forum. And then the point is, if you're going to ask for climate expertise, then you have to sort of, that this forum is the first port of call. And if somebody's not part of it, then the question is, okay, well, can we really trust them?
Thank you. So I look back at the screen, and there is a question there from the beginning. I think a lot of people are interested. So we'll switch now a bit the focus. A lot of people are interested in, and I think this relates to your talk, Julia, what exactly the system changes we need. Can you elaborate that a bit more? That's the first question.
So I've sort of become an economist, although even that's not completely clear. I would say that one of the things to think about is, what does the economy constitute? Because we basically have a system that extracts resources from the environment and does stuff with it. And that system is generally the economic system. And I have a view that's different from mainstream economics, and I think that that's one of the things we really have to be careful of, is not just adopt concepts, methods, and solutions from mainstream economics, because it's a very partial view of the world, and I would argue a very flawed view of the world, including pushing for behavior change. Like, if I have to hear this point of we need people to change their behaviors, we need to nudge them or whatever one more time, that's just taking a bad concept from mainstream economics and trying to apply it to all of society, and it's also sort of an abdication of social responsibility, and it's bad. So the point here is that what we have to think about is, what is that economy constituted of? And from a non-mainstream perspective, it's constituted of provisioning systems, so basically sectors. And you have to think about what the economy is doing at a sectoral level. What is the energy system doing? What is the transportation system doing? What is the housing system doing? What is the health system doing? And in each of those, one of the things we see is that seeking profits is generally tied to cheap extractivism, and also so environmental damage on the one hand, and on the social side, rent seeking, so basically extracting profits from the fact that people need to interact with the economy in order to live their lives. And one of the things, the clearest example of this is car dependence, regulating, enforcing the fact that people have to become dependent on their car to live. And that's something that we see in Switzerland as well. We have mandatory parking regulation. That's insane. And that's one of the things that we should also change. So for me, the system is really that economic system and the industries within it, and how they have interacted with our governments, in the case of the automotive industry, since a century, to really push their products through our society. And I think that that's one of the things we have to realize, what that looks like. It's not so different from the way tobacco operates, and that's what we have to think about changing.
Thank you. I hope this was explicit enough about system change. So we'll move to another question, which has also high ratings. There are voices or views now stating that science communication must only conveying the facts. We have mentioned this in the beginning, not being prescriptive, but only being relevant. How do you relate to this stance, and what is your experience? I think the IPCC itself is proclaiming that sentence and that view. Can you say something about this?
Yeah, maybe about the IPCC. So the IPCC role, it has been defined as being policy relevant, but not policy prescriptive. But still, I think as scientists, there are many examples where scientists basically recommend a course of action when there is a diagnosis on a given situation. You just take a doctor. So if the doctor sees that her patient is sick, then you will recommend some course of action. You're going to say, take this treatment. Of course, the patient can still decide not to do it, but you can still do a recommendation. Yeah, and if you don't do it, you are failing in your responsibility. I think, and basically in French, I would say it's a non-assistance à personne en danger. We are all in danger. If we are not communicating, we are failing our responsibility.
Yeah, I really agree with that point, because I think that one of the limits on what the IPCC was allowed to say and how should not necessarily be taken as a religion as to how science should operate. So when the IPCC is told you should be science-y, informative, not informative, not policy prescriptive, I think that we should be questioning that, because that does not necessarily come from what is actually important in terms of either the science or our moment. I think one of the narratives I'm interested in is actually about human nature, and this goes back to the dominance of mainstream economic thinking. So are we selfish? Are we short-term thinkers? Are we incapable of change? Are we, there are lots of narratives saying like, oh, people are this way, therefore what you're proposing is impossible, we might as well just give up, please burn more of our fossil fuels. And I think that that's one of the things that's really important to change in people's minds. We are at a time of very starved social imagination. We are not very good at imagining different social organizations, different ways of doing things, that we can change how the economy works, that we can change how our politics works. So we are very starved for ideas of how we can take power back and interact differently. And I think that that's one of the things that science should also be helping with, is saying, actually, we are capable of great social imagination. We are capable of making really important changes. And there are many historical examples of this.
So maybe to add an example, a question about the fact, going beyond transmitting facts. For example, this summer with the climate protection law, several climate-related scientists have issued a public declaration and supported the laws. This is explicit support of a policy, so it could kind of, in the view of the public, it could put scientists themselves in a political angle. So are there any red lines or any major risks you see in this sort of, very explicit political engagement, or do you think these activities are worthwhile and beneficial? What do you think about that?
No, I think it is worthwhile. I mean, in the end, we're also human beings. We're also citizens. So, I mean, and then we have some scientific knowledge. Of course, we would not say science prescribes you to do that, but us as human beings, as citizens, based on the knowledge we have, can support the law. I think that's our right to do it.
And I think one of the ways that you can sort of orient your thinking is like, who is really against it? And if you look at the amount of effort that the fossil fuel lobby groups and their policy affiliates, so their think tank affiliates, put into trying to shut up scientists and to get them not to be afraid to take these kinds of positions, the fact that they're so afraid about that probably means it's quite powerful and probably a good idea. So that's not the only thing one should think about, but it's also very clear that there has been a consistent effort in trying to silence and limit the communication power of scientists on the part of these industries. And we shouldn't take that as our law.
Have you personally experienced any negative reactions on this that you say had an impact, or no?
Well, not directly. I mean, I do get every once in a while some letter or some email from, maybe some SVP sympathisant, I guess. But actually, most of the feedback I get is positive.
So, yes, you can get the slides. I think I can speak in the name of the organizers. So we also have a question that moves more in the direction of, science communication. So there's some sort of, getting used about the climate change narratives. Shall we change them, for an effective science policy dialogue, and which narratives could work? I think we touched on that on several points, but maybe you can have some, concrete examples on narratives that would work better in the public dialogue.
Yeah, again, I think it's about having a vision for the future. There is actually a program also within the ScienceNet, so basically to develop those narratives, and I think we can do more of this. So, and it can be in different form. It can be more scientific. It could be also movies. I just feel that there are different ways in which we could communicate this positive narrative for the future, and I would say there it's also part of the propaganda as a negative framing of saying, oh, if you don't want to use fossil fuel, you're going to have to take some cold showers. So I mean, we have also to counteract this part of the narrative, and in different ways, as many ways as possible.
So I agree with Sonia, and that's actually my research is actually on the good life with lower resource use. So I definitely agree on that. I think that it is also important to keep an eye on the negatives, and one of the things that I think is really interesting is research by OxySuisse, which is an advocacy group against tobacco use in youth, and they have a long experience of trying to tell teenagers not to smoke, and which generally doesn't work, and they found that the one thing that works the best is letting them know how the tobacco industry is trying to manipulate them into smoking. Because teenagers do not like to be anybody's fool. And I think that we should not like to be anybody's fool, any of us. And one of the things that I think is important here is also this information about how the fossil fuel industry and its different affiliates have been trying to push us into our own self-destruction, and pushing our governments and doing basically a lot of the same tactics as the tobacco industry, because they've basically been working together and using the same strategies as each other for decades and decades. And so I think that that kind of information is really important as well, because everybody wants to, everybody loves their car. I mean, not everybody, but in theory, everybody loves their car until they learn that their car is basically a cigarette on wheels. And they learn about all the different tricks that the automotive industry has used to push them into that car dependency. And then they might, I think that that's also something that's emancipatory knowledge. It's liberating because it tells you, it gives you the possibility to make your own choices. I think that's quite important.
Yeah, I would fully support what Julia just said. I think that's a really big part of the equation, and also something that is not communicated sufficiently about. I mean, it's well demonstrated that there is massive propaganda from the fossil lobby that has happened, and actually, even into universities and in every field really of society, and there is a lot of science demonstrating this. And for instance, the first time I've basically read The Merchants of Doubts, and when you realize it was actually the same scientists who were paid by the industry who first did propaganda for the tobacco industry, and then afterwards they did propaganda for the fossil fuel lobby, you're like, how stupid can we be to listen to them? Yeah.
Thank you very much. So, we're coming to an end of the keynote session, and you also see on the screen the digital applause, people expressing their compliments for your speeches. So from my side, I thank you very much for being here, presenting your views, answering our questions and discussing. And I think we're still in this open ground. Discussions need to go on. We have seen this today, and I think there's also a lot of scope and potential to collaborate between scientists and science communicators to be more impactful in the future. Thank you very much, and I wish you a good continuation of the conference.